Hello, and thank you for joining us today for Heal Collaborative Sickle Cell Disease Community Conversation. My name is Kimba Gosier, and I'm president of Advancing Sickle Cell Advocacy Project, Inc., and we're located in Hollywood, Florida. And I will be your moderator for the physician and patient panel discussion. But before we begin our program, we'd like to thank the National Baptist Convention for inviting Heal Collaborative to bring this education program to your 2021 Congress of Christian Education and your attendees from around the nation. We'd also like to thank the sponsor of today's program, Vertex and CRISPR Therapeutics, for their commitment to developing life-saving therapies for sickle cell and thalassemia patient communities. As a caregiver of a young adult with sickle cell disease, I know firsthand the importance of sickle cell warriors having timely access to quality care and a dedicated, trained team of specialists, nurses, and social workers. With that, we will start with our physician and patient panel discussion. On this panel, we will hear from Dr. Santosh Saraf, a Chicago-based hematologist who specializes in adult sickle cell disease. And from the great state of Georgia, Deborah Spooney will tell us about her journey living with sickle cell disease. Following this panel discussion will be the policy panel, where we will hear from policymakers and patient advocates on the front line of further legislation to improve the lives of sickle cell patients. So let's get started. Welcome, Dr. Saraf. You are our content expert for today. Can you tell us a bit about your background and take us right into your presentation on sickle cell?
Sure, thank you for the invitation. My name is Santosh Saraf. I'm a hematologist who focuses on sickle cell disease, particularly for the care of adults with sickle cell disease. And my clinical work includes transplant and monitoring and treating kidney disease in the context of sickle cell disease. So over the next 15 to 20 minutes, I'm going to provide an overview of sickle cell disease, followed by some resources that people can go to for education and to learn more about sickle cell disease. So what is sickle cell disease? It's an inherited red blood cell disorder that affects hemoglobin. So what does that mean? The red blood cells function is to deliver oxygen in the body. And the main molecule that does that is hemoglobin. In sickle cell disease, there's a single amino acid that's changed in the beta globin gene of the chain of the hemoglobin molecule. And what happens is after this hemoglobin delivers oxygen, it causes the hemoglobin to collapse and polymerize, and that causes the red cell to sickle. And so in this cartoon, you can see that you have a round red blood cell. It gives off oxygen, and after that oxygen is removed, the hemoglobin polymerizes or collapses and causes the red cell to form a sickled shape. This leads to red blood cell rigidity, which can cause to obstruction of blood flow. When this happens, it also causes the red blood cell to break down, and that can lead to severe anemia. So how is sickle cell disease inherited? The first thing to remember is that sickle cell disease is a genetic condition. That means that it's inherited from DNA from your parents. It is not something that can be transmitted from one person to another by contact or by a blood transfusion or by infections. This is something that is inherited. It is diagnosed by newborn screening, and symptoms usually present during the first year of life. 1 in 10 African Americans are carriers or have the sickle cell trait, and 1 in 365 African Americans have sickle cell disease. And this cartoon gives a schematic of how it can be inherited. So in this case, the mom and dad are both carriers. They have 1 hemoglobin A and 1 sickle hemoglobin DNA. And they will pass one of these 2 on randomly to each child. And so each child will either get 1 of the A's or 1 of the S's. And so in this case, the child received 2 hemoglobin A's. Here the children received 1 hemoglobin A and 1 hemoglobin S, and this child received 2 of the hemoglobin S's, 1 from each parent. And this is the patient that will go on to have symptoms of sickle cell disease. And so if both parents are carriers, 1 in 4, 25% of children can be AA, 50% are sickle cell trait, and 25% chance of having that child have both hemoglobin S molecules or having sickle cell disease. So this hemoglobin S has persisted through thousands of years because it also has a protective effect, and it protects against malaria, which is a very dangerous infection of red blood cells. And if you look at where malaria is distributed in Western Africa, Central Africa, the Mediterranean region, the Middle East, and in India, you see that the sickle hemoglobin is also present in those regions. And so you have dense pockets in Western and Central Africa. You have some regions in the Mediterranean, the Saudi Arabia, and a dense pocket in India as well. And so if you look at the global face of sickle cell disease, people of all different colors can have sickle cell disease. The life expectancy for people with sickle cell disease has also been changing over time. For about 60 years, people with sickle cell disease had an average lifespan of 5 to 10 years of age. But with certain initiatives like the National Sickle Cell Act, which implemented newborn screening, penicillin prophylaxis, hydroxyurea therapy, and transfusion for stroke prevention, we've seen that each of these therapies have led to progressive improvements in life expectancy in people with sickle cell disease. When we look at mortality patterns or patterns of death, we see that in children, we've seen a substantial improvement in mortality. However, when we look at the mortality in adults, we do see that the life expectancy has shifted to the right, but it's still substantially lower than the general population. So still showing that we have a lot of work to do, still a lot of clinical trials and therapies that we need to develop to help people with sickle cell disease. One of the most important developments that emerged for sickle cell disease was penicillin prophylaxis. And this was pioneered by Dr. Marilyn Gaston. And what she had observed was that children with sickle cell disease, especially when their immune system was still developing as a young age, they were at risk of streptococcal pneumonia infections. This is the bacteria that can cause strep throat, but it can also cause a dangerous pneumonia. And what she hypothesized was that if you give people penicillin at that very young age in children with sickle cell disease, perhaps you could protect them from this strep pneumoniae until their immune system develops further. And so in a clinical trial of 215 children with sickle cell disease, and she found that the children that received penicillin had lower rates of infection and serious infections. And as a result of this study and newborn screening, more than 95% of children with sickle cell disease now survive into adulthood. Another really important clinical study that helped improve our patients with sickle cell disease was hydroxyurea. And in those people that received hydroxyurea, an improvement in vaso-occlusive crises, acute chest syndrome, which is a very severe pain episode in the chest, accompanied often by pneumonia and low oxygen, and transfusion needs were all improved with hydroxyurea. This led to an FDA approval in 1998, and in children it was approved, unfortunately, 20 years later, but still approved. And this therapy seems to be very important in helping protecting from symptoms as well as organ damage in sickle cell disease. So here's a timeline of therapies to treat sickle cell disease. And hydroxyurea was approved in 1998, but we had a really long time span where this was our only therapy that we had for people with sickle cell disease. But then 20 years later, in 2017, L-glutamine, which helps improve the antioxidant level in the body, was approved to reduce crises. In 2019, voxelotor, which helps stop the hemoglobin from collapsing and helps improve anemia, was approved. And crizanlizumab, which is an IV infusion that's given over 30 minutes every month, was shown to help reduce crises as well. So now we have a few more tools to help improve sickle cell disease in our patients. So a couple of complications that I wanted to highlight. First is a pain crisis or a vaso-occlusive crisis. This happens when the red blood cells become really rigid and block the blood flow, and this can cause severe pain or pain episodes. Some things to note are that the onset can be sudden, the severity of the pain can range from mild to severe, and most importantly, there are no specific tests for diagnosis. So there's not a lab test, there is not an imaging test that says that this person has a crisis. You have to listen to the patient, and if the patient is in pain, you have to treat them as though they have a pain crisis. Prevention seems to be key. We want to make sure that our patients are well hydrated. If it's hot, make sure that you're pushing the fluids even more. You also have to be careful in low oxygen situations because when you give off that oxygen, the hemoglobin collapses and sickles. So be careful in high altitudes or with vigorous exercise. Vaccinations are also important because infections may trigger a vaso-occlusion. And then we have therapies like hydroxyurea, L-glutamine, and crizanlizumab. For treatment, unfortunately, it's mostly supportive. It's IV hydration and pain medications, but there is no specific therapy at this time to resolve the vaso-occlusion. So it's still a very important need of therapy that we have. The other thing that's important to know is that in addition to the pain crises, the sickling can cause damage to very important organ systems. And the heart, lung, and kidney complications account for about half of identifiable causes of death. For the heart, one of the screening tools that we have is an echocardiogram. This is an ultrasound of the heart. They can look at how well the heart is pumping. It can look if the heart is facing higher pressures within the lung system called pulmonary hypertension, or if the heart is becoming stiff and developing diastolic dysfunction. One of the most important ways to protect the heart is to have a lower blood pressure. The lung is also very important. We can monitor oxygen levels by something called pulse oximetry, which is a little device that you put on the finger to measure the oxygen levels. A more formal test is called a pulmonary function test, where people do breathing testing. And the most important marker so far seems to be something called an FEV1, or how much you can breathe out in 1 second. And if that reduces, which you can see in things like obstructive lung disease or COPD, but also in sickle cell disease, that could be a measure that there is some lung damage that's happening. In terms of prevention, it's important to avoid smoking and to be vaccinated because these infections can lead to scarring in the lungs and damage your lung function. Another really important organ system that's affected in sickle cell disease are the kidneys. The kidney damage happens very early, and the first measure of kidney dysfunction is that you can't concentrate your urine. And this can actually put our people at risk for getting dehydrated. Other markers that we can measure are the serum creatinine, and something that's really important that we're trying to have our practitioners test more often is the urine albumin. This is one of the first markers of kidney damage. And these can be used to identify sudden damage to the kidney as well as chronic damage to the kidney. In terms of prevention, again, blood pressure control is very important. Hydroxyurea therapy can help protect the kidney in some instances. And then avoiding regular use of medicines that may stress or damage the kidney, like ibuprofen, naproxen, or other medicines, especially on a regular basis. These can be damaging to the kidney, so use those with caution. So with these pain episodes and chronic organ damage, our patients have very impaired quality of lives, especially those that are having frequent complications. And one study here that was really interesting showed that if you look at the quality of life scale, our patients with sickle cell disease have a similar quality of life to people with cancer on chemotherapy. And that's a really heavy kind of observation. And something that's often been missed. You know, people with sickle cell disease may not show their pain or show the organ damage, but they're suffering just as much as somebody with cancer on chemotherapy. When people have been surveyed for pain, adults with sickle cell disease have pain 55% of the days. This impacts ability to attend school and work, and increased pain is associated with a lower quality of life. In addition, a high proportion of patients have depression, about a third, and depression is associated with lower quality of life and higher needs for hospitalization. Sickle cell trait is something that affects 1 in 10 African Americans, and it also may have some clinical complications that need to be that everybody should be aware of. First and foremost is that on lab or routine blood work, you cannot distinguish sickle cell trait from somebody without sickle cell trait. The blood counts are normal. There are not signs of anemia or increased signs of red blood cell markers. One of the clinical problems that you should be aware of is that the kidneys, which are a really kind of low oxygen, high acid kind of environment, the kidneys are susceptible to damage. And you can see things like urine concentrating defects and chronic kidney disease, as you do see in sickle cell disease. It happens at a lower rate and at a later age, but it still should be monitored very closely. There are also certain conditions where you want to be very careful in. First is athletics. If you are engaged in sports, stay well hydrated, build your intensity slowly. Don't go from 0 to 60 miles an hour. Go gradually building your intensity and your length of exercising. Rest often, and if you feel unwell, seek medical care. The other condition to be careful in is low oxygen conditions, such as high altitudes, scuba diving, or if you're exercising extremely hard, follow those measures that are above. So here are some of the national resources through the American Society of Hematology, CDC, and the NHLBI, or National Institutes of Health. And here are some links to the websites where they have some general information. Specific information can come from the Sickle Cell Disease Association of America. They have lots of really high utility and important topics, including COVID-19, clinical trials and studies to be involved with disability issues, educational materials, links to other medical websites and sickle cell communities, and school information. And the one that I really like, and I'll finish off on, is Sickle Cell Warriors. This is on the One SCD Voice website. It's a nonprofit charitable organization dedicated to education, empowerment, and awareness about sickle cell disease. And their mission is to inspire those affected by sickle cell. And I really like this one quote that I saw on their website that I'd like to read for everybody to kind of consider. Sickle cell warriors are powerful people with an indomitable spirit. They are often in a constant fight on a daily basis to keep our head above water, deal with the pain, make the right decisions in life, deal with finances, medical bills, and handle the backlash, negative vibes, and criticism that having sickle cell brings. These are really heavy words and things that we should keep in mind when we think about sickle cell disease and people that are suffering from sickle cell disease. They're fighting a big battle, and it's important that we understand this sickle cell disease and provide support for our patients. And with that, I'd like to thank the patient and families with sickle cell disease and a huge team that we have at the University of Illinois at Chicago, led by Dr. Victor Gorduc, and the support that we get from the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute from the NIH. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Saraf, for that great overview of sickle cell disease and some of the barriers and challenges facing sickle cell warriors. I like the fact that you touched on how it affects the organs. I know that pain is the hallmark of the disease, and a lot of people think of sickle cell, they think of pain, but you demonstrated how it can affect many of the organ systems. So that's very important. Also, the fact that you pointed out from 1998 to 2017, we got our first FDA approved drug in 20 years. So that shows how we were lagging behind. So it's great to know that we have more treatments on the horizon to improve the quality of life of those with sickle cell disease. And also, it really resonated the fact that to compare sickle cell to a cancer patient receiving chemotherapy, that really resonated, and I'm sure it resonated with a lot of people. So thank you so much for that presentation. Thank you. Next, we have Deborah Spooney, who will tell us her story, her life as an adult living with sickle cell disease and other family members living with sickle cell disease. Welcome, Deborah.
Hello, good afternoon. I am 52 years old. I was diagnosed with sickle cell disease at 9 years of age. They did not test for it as a newborn for me, but I was consistently and constantly sick growing up. And so finally, I was in the hospital to have the tonsils out, and the blood was too low, and he just ran a battery of tests until he figured it out. And so I was diagnosed, like I said, at 9 years old. I'm in Georgia. I lived in South Georgia, which is the country. I guess healthcare was limited, especially for a little Black girl. I don't know. And so when they figured it out, I started going to Augusta Medical Center. And I would go there quarterly. And generally, I was not in the hospital. I didn't have to go into the hospital. If I got sick, I would get antibiotics, penicillin, and I would eventually get well. Then I went to college and I got really sick. Still didn't end up in the hospital though. In college, I didn't have health insurance. I didn't have Medicare, Medicaid, any of those types of things that would help. And so if I got sick, I would just sleep until I got better. Still not really being, I guess, treated or cared for by a physician constantly. Then I guess we would go into my 40s, and that's when I really started getting sick. And I finally, at that point, found a hematologist that I'm still with to this day, and he is excellent. I had to have a full blood exchange, and that was in 2013. And I was well for 5 years after that. No crises, no pain, nothing. And then all of a sudden I started getting sick again. So 1 year I was in the hospital every month, and I would get blood transfusion, or sometimes I would just get pain medicine until the pain went away. And one thing I started trying to do is research and try to understand, okay, what triggers this? What will cause me to have a crisis? And the one thing I did realize, dehydration for certain. Anytime I got dehydrated, soon thereafter, I would have a crisis. Also, if I was to have diarrhea or get sick or throw up or anything like that, anything that would cause me dehydration, eventually, shortly thereafter, I would have a crisis. So I'm nowadays trying to stay hydrated, if nothing else. But my most recent crisis was in January of this year, and it was so weird. My arm from my elbow to my shoulder just started hurting and would not stop. And it went like across my body because my chest started hurting. And then the other arm from my elbow to my shoulder started hurting. My chest did stop hurting, but those two continued to hurt. And I was in the hospital for 6 days. That was the longest I'd ever had to stay in the hospital. Like I said, my hemoglobin was normal, and what's normal for me is around 9. So when I got to the emergency room, I'm able to call my doctor, my hematologist. I called him. He says, you're probably having a crisis. You need to go to the hospital. Go to the emergency room. We'll get you admitted, and I'll treat you from there. So I get to the emergency room, and with COVID, I wasn't allowed to have anybody with me. So this was a bad experience for me. I get to the hospital. They're in no rush. I'm in all kinds of pain. And eventually I get into a room. Doctor comes see me. They take my blood and they see it's normal. So they're ready to dismiss me. They did give me pain medicine, and I assume they called Dr. Collins, who's my hematologist, because he did not allow them to dismiss me. And I got into a room, and there were 29 people on the sickle cell floor and 4 nurses for that whole time. And so the care was, I don't say I got bad care at that point, but it was just very, very different. I'm used to at least having a family member there with me, making sure because if you're medicated, you're not always cognizant of what's going on around you. And so there was no one there with me. So I was trying to stay awake or try not to use as much pain medication so I could tell what was going on. That was probably the worst experience I'd ever had at the hospital. And since then, I've been trying to make sure I stay well. If I start having pains, I take the pain medication sooner than later. And I'm not going back to the hospital. And I know that's crazy because at some point I will probably have to go back to the hospital, but it was just that traumatic for me. And I guess long story short, I do have family members. I have 3 brothers and a sister. And most of the time when I'm sick, one of the brothers is at the hospital with me or at home with me, making sure I have everything I need. I have a niece that has sickle cell, and she's 16, and she's only had 1 crisis. She was 2 maybe when she had her first crisis and her only crisis. I have a nephew, he's 11. He was in the hospital every other year after he turned 2. Around me, I have my church. I'm very active with the church, and I have a circle of sisters that are constantly praying for me or with me. Whenever I'm in a crisis, they're going to show up for sure. And I think those are the things that make this disease bearable.
Thank you so much, Deborah, for your transparency and sharing, and condolences to losing your cousin as well. I just want to say that personally, you're an inspiration to me as a mom of a 30-year-old with sickle cell disease, because when my daughter was 2 years old, I was told that don't plan for college for her by a physician, and she's now 30. So you're living proof that, whose report shall we believe?
Right.
Yes. And I'm sure you're an inspiration for your niece and nephew because you've gone through so much and you can be a mentor for them. So that's great. That's very good. Especially being an adult with sickle cell, it's extremely important to have an advocate, a very strong support system. So they're very blessed to have you as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so now we'll begin our question and answer session. Let's start with Dr. Saraf. Dr. Saraf, how can doctors care for the primary physical diagnosis of sickle cell, but also address the mental health part of it? I know in your presentation, you touched on the aspect of the child missing so much school. Some of them may not be able to work. So can you please give us some information or insight on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that the physical and the mental are tied really together. Having the pain causes the mental stress and the psychological stress and vice versa. I think that the psychological stress worsens the pain. So I think that they're very tightly linked. One thing that we have had on and off is health psychologists in our clinic. And so for people that are having frequent pain, we strongly recommend having a health psychologist assess the patient just to see if there are any signs of depression, anxiety, or anything else that we could try to help address. They can provide teaching techniques for pain management, distraction techniques, breathing techniques. If medications are needed, they can refer them to the appropriate person. But I think the psychosocial stressors and the physical component are very tightly linked and both need to be addressed. And there is actually a study that we're part of, and it screens for suicidal ideation. And we've been really surprised that even things like suicidal ideation, if people don't have an active plan, the suicidal ideation, especially in those that are having lots of pain crises, is very high. So I think that we are missing this diagnosis and we need to be more vigilant for it.
That's great that you're doing that at your facility. Hopefully other doctors and facilities will follow suit with that because that's very important.
Definitely.
Thank you. So Deborah, what tools have you used over the years to help you manage with sickle cell disease that you can share with our community?
I believe the biggest help for me over the years was when I actually got a hematologist that actually knew about the disease. He has been, I would say, my biggest advocate, and I appreciate him so much. But before him, I would go to the emergency rooms. I'd say I'm having a sickle cell crisis. Now, one thing, sickle cell is an acute disease, so they will move you ahead of the crowd or move you back to the back or to a room faster than if you went in and had cut your finger or something. But I would go, they would test me. They're saying we're not seeing any signs. And so at a point, I would just deal with the pain until I couldn't deal with it. And then one time I went, and that was my first time having to have a blood transfusion. They were like, your chest is hurting because your heart is about to stop. You don't even have enough blood. It's trying to pump nothing to the rest of your body. So they gave me a blood transfusion. Eventually I got better, but most of the time they wouldn't even send me home with the prescription. A good doctor and someone that's going to track you and care enough about you to give you their cell number and say, call me if you have problems or if you have questions. And then your social circles, your sister friends, your brother buddies, and girlfriends, they are not going to let you just sit around and be sad or be depressed or not go somewhere or not do something because you don't feel like it, or you're trying not to get sick and trying to make sure you're okay. They're going to keep an eye on you. They're going to call you. They're going to be praying for you. And I know many a times prayers are what have brought me through. I mean, I had a praying grandmother, I got a praying mother. And I think those are the biggest things I could say are the reason I'm still here.
Amen. Thank you for sharing. So what I'm getting from you, Deborah, is having a very knowledgeable, very good doctor, a good hematologist on your team, and having a strong support system.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Have you experienced the same thing, like when you had to take your daughter to the emergency room, that she's known since she was 2, so you probably
Yes.
have a battery of doctors, but if she was, say, out of town and got sick and would have to go to an emergency room, do you think she would get as good a care as
Well, to be honest, that's an issue that we're facing here in Florida. And not only Florida, I know it's a nationwide problem with the way adults are treated with sickle cell. And I think it's very good that you have firsthand knowledge and experience, so you can help your niece and nephew, because they're at that age now where they're getting ready to transition. And it's like a whole nother world. So you can help them and prepare them for that. But it's a struggle. It's a struggle. It's a struggle every time you go to the emergency room. And unfortunately, a lot of times, I'm being honest, a lot of times the patients get flagged and treated as they're seeking narcotics when they're in pain. And that's very, very unfortunate that happens. They didn't do anything wrong except be born with a blood disorder.
Right.
So that's an issue that we're facing, that's a constant uphill battle. Our next question is for Dr. Saraf. Can you give us any insight about what sickle cell disease will look like in the future? Any possible curative therapies that are being worked on currently?
Yeah, I think I'm hoping the future is bright. We have these new tools right now that can help target different parts of sickle cell disease. So L-glutamine is a powder that helps. It's supposed to, we think, help improve the antioxidants and reduce the inflammation. So that's one option. Crizanlizumab, or Adakveo, is an infusion that stops the red cell from sticking to the blood vessels and is supposed to help it flow better and prevent crises. And then for people that have a lot of hemolysis and anemia, Voxelotor or Oxbryta helps actually stabilize the red cell and prevent it from breaking down too aggressively. So I think that people kind of tilt towards either having lots of crises or lots of anemia and organ damage. And so we may have therapies that might be tailored to what our patients are experiencing. In terms of curative therapies, bone marrow transplant has been something that's been mostly used for children, but as the regimens have improved, we're able to give them to older and older people. We've transplanted people up until the upper 50s with sickle cell disease successfully. And I know at the NIH, they've done people in their 60s. So we know that these therapies are becoming more broadly available to our patients. And I think the wave of the future is gene therapy. This is where you're your own donor, where you take out the person's own stem cells, either switch something that switches the hemoglobin back to the one that you had as a baby called fetal hemoglobin that doesn't have the sickle switch, or actually correct the beta globin switch and give those cells back to the person. And then you don't have to worry about rejection or where the stem cells attack your body, called graft versus host disease. And so I think that's something that's going to be in the future. I don't know if it's going to happen in 5, 10, 15, or 20 years, but I think that's what I envision will be an option for people.
Thank you for sharing that. I know we have a long way to go, but that's very encouraging news, hearing those treatment options. So thank you so much for sharing. I know we can go on for hours. Our time is kind of limited because sickle cell is so complex. We can definitely go on for hours talking about it. So I would love to thank you, Dr. Saraf, and Ms. Deborah Spooney for sharing today with the National Baptist Convention. We hope that you were educated with this overview of sickle cell disease. You were able to take something from this presentation and that you learned something. Thank you. Up next is our policy panel. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Ashley Valentine. I'm co-founder and president of Sickle, and today I'm joined by Reverend Ellen Love and Senator Maddie Hunter, and we'll be talking today about public policy as it relates to sickle cell disease. So before we get started, just a brief introduction about myself. I'm co-founder of Sickle. The other co-founder is my brother Marcus. He was an adult living with sickle cell disease. He lived until 36 years old. And his vision was to ensure that the patient's story got to everyone that could listen to learn about sickle cell disease. And my passion really is policy and government affairs. So we combined our visions and our passions together to tell stories about people with sickle cell disease to eliminate stigma and also influence decision makers and really form policy. So if we can do introductions before we get started with the panel. Reverend Love, would you like to introduce yourself? And then Senator Hunter, you can go next.
Certainly. Thank you, Ashley. My name is Pastor Alvin Love. I pastor the Lilydale First Baptist Church in the city of Chicago. I also serve as the director of faith-based initiatives for the National Baptist Convention USA Incorporated, which is the largest African-American denomination in this country. And so we're delighted to be able to host this discussion around sickle cell.
And hello, I'm State Senator Maddie Hunter from the state of Illinois. I live in Chicago. I have served in the Illinois State Senate since 2003. And the majority of the bills that I have passed over the years has been mostly centered around health and human services. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Fantastic. Pastor Love, I have a question for you. So we understand that the National Baptist Convention has the HOPE, the HOPE initiative, that includes a focus on sickle cell disease. Can you tell us a little more about that program?
Well, in the year 2010, I was working with the Obama administration in the area of faith-based outreach, and we created a department in the National Baptist Convention that mirrored the federal faith-based initiatives on the federal level. We brought that down to our convention level. And so one of those departments that we created in 2010 was the health department to mirror the health faith-based offices on the federal level. In 2011, we created the HOPE initiative, and the acronym really stands for Healthy Outreach and Prevention Education. And with that, we work with the Sickle Cell Disease Association of America. We try to keep our National Baptist Convention constituents abreast on the latest developments and the information coming out of that as it relates to sickle cell. We provide workshops at our two largest meetings. We have a gathering in September that normally has about, when we could meet in person, about 20,000 delegates. We also have a meeting in June, which is our Congress of Christian Education. It can have as much as 30 to 35,000 delegates and maybe 50 to 60,000 attendees. And so what we do during that time is provide information and workshops, as well as opportunities to present to our constituents during those meetings. We encourage all of our National Baptist Convention churches, as well as organize them to participate in the annual Sickle Cell Sabbath, which is the third Sunday in September. And so on that day, all of our 35,000 churches will focus in on sickle cell disease in those churches on the third Sunday in September. So our goal is to bring hope to our convention and our communities, to take actions that will help deal with the health disparities in the African American communities, and to bring about a better quality of life and health outcomes to each and every one of those. And so, I really like the idea, and I'm glad to be on this panel with Senator Hunter, because part of what we do in our faith-based initiatives is, we work to bring resources down to the local level, but we also work to take policy from the local level and push it all the way up to the federal government level. And so, in a nutshell, I think that's a brief description of the HOPE initiative and our faith-based initiatives health department.
I think that's a really important program. Thank you for that summary. Because, as we know, sickle cell disproportionately does impact Black and Hispanic and Black and Brown people. But what we see in a lot of our work is many people don't know that they are carriers of sickle cell trait, or they believe that they don't know anyone with sickle cell disease. So, sometimes people say, well, it doesn't affect me, so I won't care about it. So programs like these are really important because it shows you that everyone is impacted by sickle cell disease, and it does take everyone in our community to make real change. And then it highlights the importance of policy in order to make sure those changes are permanent. So thinking about this, I do have a question for both of you now. So can you tell the faith community why it is important that the Black church has its voice heard in the halls of the state legislators? Senator Hunter, why don't we go with you first, and then Pastor Love?
Sure, Ashley. That's an excellent question. Excuse me. I'd like the faith community to know that your participation in the legislature arena is vitally important in moving the issue of sickle cell towards forward in the Illinois General Assembly. We do not hear enough from our constituents, especially from the community period, whether you're a faith community, you're a student, a business person, and we need to hear from you guys, because as we are structuring and putting together our legislative agenda, we can use input from the community, and it's not enough. And so many people complain that all those legislators, they aren't doing this, they aren't doing that. Well, tell us what you want, because we're not mind readers. You live in the community, you are on the ground, and so if you do not make us aware of what the issues are in the community, we will never know. And just know that if you don't speak for sickle cell patients, nobody else will, So we're going to put it on you, and it is your responsibility, because it is vital that you contact your state legislators. It is important to educate them, us, on the disease. You are experts, and we are experts somewhat, but you all are experts, especially family members who care for sickle cell patients. And you can relate to us in terms of what exactly is going on with the patient. We've heard quite a bit, but it's always good to hear from you, and what it does and what it can do, to what you can and cannot do to address the issues in this chronically underserved disease. Also, tell them personal stories, as I mentioned earlier, about the challenges, and make us aware of what's going on out there.
That's great, Senator Hunter. You lifted a word there, a phrase there that you said, we're on the ground. And I think that is exactly where the church needs to be responsive to our state legislatures, our national legislatures, because we are on the ground, and we have the instant touch that we can get that information back to influence the policy. I remember when President Obama was first elected, I called him and asked him, what is it that he wanted me to do? And I told him I wasn't going to Washington, D.C., so I don't need a job. I'm staying in Chicago, but what is it you want me to do? And he said to me then, he said, Rev, I want to put the resources of the federal government on the ground where the local communities can get a hold of them. And so my response to him was that I'm on the ground. You let me know where the resource is. Give us a chance to bring policy back. I'll connect it to it and get out of the way. I think part of of what the local church and church organizations need to do is to learn how to become a conduit rather than to get in the middle of it and try to do the work of the legislature. You know, I think sometimes we get so involved and, you know, we're big on protesting and making our voices heard when something comes up that we don't like. But I think part of our responsibility ought to be to bring those issues to our legislatures, to let them know what we think, even to help with the research if necessary, to make certain that they have all the information that they need in order to push strong and positive policy towards our communities, and then get out of the way. Let them do their job. All right. I know that my job as a community leader, as a pastor, as a preacher, but I'm not a legislator. So if I can bring those people on the ground face to face with the legislators of my state and of the nation, then I can get out of the way. They have all the information that they need. And then I can sit back and hold them accountable to what we've discussed and what we decided to do in those meetings. And I think that's one of the things that the church needs to do, learn how to push policy. We're real good at asking for resources. You know, we'll say we need X amount of dollars to do this program, to do that program. That's fine. But we need to actually share that policy with our elected officials so that they can really use their leverage and their expertise to do a better job of reacting and responding to the needs of the community. So thank you, Senator Hunter. That on the ground piece is good for me because that's where I am.
My pleasure, Reverend. I appreciate everything that you guys are doing.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Yeah, and you know, so Sickle does a lot of storytelling, and we do storytelling on a national level as a way to influence policy. And what I'm hearing from both of you is, you know, you as an individual are an expert in what you need, and therefore you need to then work with your legislators, your state legislators, so that they can help you get what you need. So being proactive in terms of advocacy and policy.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we talk about some of the things that the church does not do. And I think one of the things that we fall short in is telling our story. Yes. Learning how to be storytellers about if we do a third Sunday in September blitz across this country and nobody knows it, then you know we've really missed our effectiveness. The only effectiveness we've had is in that closed community of the people that meet with us on that Sunday morning. But we need to make that known nationally so that millions of people will know and get a better understanding of what's going on, particularly in this instance with sickle cell.
Yeah, that's great. And so here's a question. We talk about millions of people knowing what's going on, and sometimes that makes me think of the media. How can the church become more educated on legislation that will have an effect on the communities of color without being led by the media? So where else can they go? What other resources can the church use apart from just the media to become educated on legislation, on policy, and how to get involved?
In order to educate, to know more about anything, you need to learn how to conduct your own research, first of all. And then here in Illinois, we have a website called ilga.com. ILGA stands for Illinois ILGA General Assembly.com. And it's a great resource. You know, you can track a bill and you can see what it does, where it's going, who the sponsors are. And then you can pull up any legislator in the state of Illinois on that ilga.com. Our office address is on there, the phone number. I mean, anything that you can even research if you do not know who your legislator is, your state rep or your state senator is, you can research it right there on that same webpage. And in any scenario, you can always reach out to your legislator's office to gain more understanding, or even set up what they call a lousy meeting. If you want to have a meeting with a legislator, our contact information is on there, you know? Yeah. Very resourceful.
I happen to believe there's no such thing as a lousy meeting with your legislators.
I would have to agree. I think you're all very
Good.
informative.
Right.
Good.
Particularly when we follow the steps that you just outlined. We come to
Mhm.
that meeting having done our own research and have some idea of what we want. I really wanted to talk more about the positive things that churches are doing, but I do understand that sometimes we go into meetings as pastors and as churches, as community leaders without an ask. We're happy having a meeting. Once we get there, we don't know what we want. So I think we need to go into those meetings armed with information. Our convention, our church, our churches, we work with the Sickle Cell Disease Association of America. We partner with them. But our faith-based initiative department is designed to move us directly into the federal level in all of these areas. We work with the Office of Minority Health within the Department of Health and Human Services. In 2011, I took 89 National Baptist Convention leaders from across the country into 2-day briefings at the White House with their counterparts on the federal level to make sure that we establish those relationships, that those people in, let's say, in the health department knew who our health department leader, Dr. Michael Miner, they knew who he was, knew how to contact him, so that everybody got their contact information. And then also to lay policy issues. We spent several months prior to that meeting laying out the policy issues that we wanted to bring. And so those are the kinds of things that we do now. We will be doing that again shortly, all right, with this new administration. We try to do it with every administration when they come in. We're going to give President Biden an opportunity to get his feet on the ground and his people in place. And then we're going to do the same thing. We're going to sit down in Washington, D.C. with every counterpart, and we'll bring those issues, the kinds of things that Senator Hunter has lifted up in her Senate bill here in Illinois. We want to take that as a model to Washington, D.C. and say we need to be pushing these kinds of things to deal with health disparities in sickle cell on a national level, and to do it with national groups. One of the great things is that this template that we've used has been adopted by many other minority denominations across the country. And so when we all get together and pool our strength and our resources, I think we're better able to affect policy on a national level. No, well, I think actually one other thing that our HOPE initiative, one of the things that we have done is we've traveled across the country in churches and trained about 600 health ambassadors. So that we have ambassadors throughout this nation who can help. And our goal, of course, is to have one health ambassador at least in every one of our churches across the country, so that that person becomes a resource individual within a local church. We're at the point now where we have it in every state, and sometimes in most major cities, we have at least one health ambassador in that city, so that if the churches in that area know who that person is, they can get their needs met, they can get their questions answered. They need research help, they can contact that person who will push it up to our federal office, and we will bring that research back down to the local level. And so we try to create that with this nationwide pool of health ambassadors.
That's wonderful.
Wow.
And, I think
Awesome.
something else that you both highlighted is the importance of an ask. So it's one thing to say, oh, I need this. It's another thing to specifically say what for. And the best examples I can come up with is often in sickle cell, we say we need funding, we need funding, we need funding. But sometimes we don't say how much we need or what we're going to use it for. So I think it's a really important piece to highlight that when you go to meet with your legislators, you have an ask. A clear ask of what you need. So there's one other thing I wanted to talk about, and you touched on this a little with your health ambassadors in each church. So what is the church doing to foster the potential for a more collaborative approach with policymakers at the state level?
Well, I think I'll come down to the local church. I'll just start with my own church, right? But one of the things that we try to do, most churches used to have nurses boards. And those nurses boards were generally made up of individuals who would dress in white on Sunday and hand you a box of Kleenex and a fan. All right. What we've tried to do over the years is morph that into a health and wellness ministry that deals with whatever health issues and concerns that confront our community. I remember in my own community, on the very block that my church is, I had 4 members pass with breast cancer back in the 80s. All female, died of breast cancer. And I found out that my community was the highest rated breast cancer area in the state of Illinois. So then we had to figure out why. And then we had to go to the legislature and say, we need money for mammography screening. We need money to train people to run those machines so that we can reduce that kind of mortality rate. I think the same thing is needed when it comes to sickle cell. We can find out how many people in our church suffer from sickle cell. And I think that when I'm just one church, but if you take that and you've got, 7.5 million people across the country in our convention, and we know from each one of those 35,000 churches how many people have sickle cell, we're armed with a lot of information to go back to our state legislatures and to the Office of Minority Health, to the Department of Health and Human Services, to the Biden administration and say, we need $25 million so that we can address this. And I'm pretty sure that when we get all those numbers, we can go back and say, we need much more than $25 million in order to turn it around and to change it, to really do the kind of research we need to cut out. This is, I can't really say a health disparity because sickle cell really affects us more than anybody. And so I think to address an area that is, I think, neglected on the national and federal level, to bring those resources down. And if we can get those kind of resources brought into our state legislatures, then Senator Maddie Hunter won't have to fight so hard trying to pull money out of the Illinois coffers, right? Because it'll be coming down from the federal level as well.
So I have one more question here, our last question. So we have talked about, the disparities with sickle cell disease, we're trying to get funding for sickle cell disease, but we've had a really fruitful conversation here today. So we always like to end all interviews with this question. What gives you hope for sickle cell disease?
Reverend, would you like to start first?
Okay, well, there are 2 things that give me hope. One is, I think the church finally awakening to an understanding of its, I think, immense influence and the opportunities to actually be engaged and be involved, not just simply in pulling in resources, but in directing policy, learning through groups like HEAL, our own health profile, so that we can take care of our own members, and then we'll know which issues we should be addressing. So that gives me hope. The second thing that gives me tremendous hope is having legislators like Senator Hunter, who are willing to say, we want to hear from you so that we can help craft the kind of legislation we need to address the issues that are most important to you. When you have those kind of legislators and you're able to speak with them, then you really don't have any bad meetings. Every opportunity to sit down at the table becomes productive and it becomes fruitful. And so those 2 things give me great hope. And thank you, Senator Hunter, for sharing with us today. And thank you for your legislation here in the state of Illinois.
Thank you very much for those kind words, Reverend Love. And I'm telling you, if we all come together, God knows how much we can accomplish. If everyone comes together, we can resolve some of these issues out here in our community. So thank you very much. Yes, sir. Thank you very much.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much both for your time. This has been a really, really insightful conversation. And thank you for letting me moderate. It's a pleasure meeting with both of you.
My pleasure.
Thank you for leading our discussions, and
Absolutely.
been wonderful.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
It has been. Thank you.